Okay, so you've probably noticed virtual reality, VR, it's really picking up steam lately, right?
Absolutely. You see companies like Meta, Apple pushing out new headsets. They're getting, much more available.
Yeah, and for most people right now, the thought immediately goes to entertainment. So gaming, maybe those immersive films, virtual casinos, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and look, that's a big part of it for sure. Those are driving a lot of the current adoption.
Right.
But the tech itself is moving so fast,
Mm.
and its potential, well, it goes way beyond just having fun.
Exactly what we want to dive into today. We're looking at one specific piece, an article by Clarence Oxford, to kind of peer beyond the entertainment side
Mm,
and explore how VR might, seriously change our everyday lives, maybe sooner than we think.
right. Our mission really is to pull out the key ideas from Oxford's article. He argues pretty strongly that these changes aren't just like 50 years down the line possibilities,
No.
because the technology is growing so quickly they could be much closer.
And this matters to you listening because we're talking about fundamental stuff. How your house or office might be designed and built.
Yeah, how you might see a doctor.
Or even how we think about like value, what owning something even means when it's digital.
It touches a lot of areas.
Okay, so let's unpack what Oxford actually sees coming. First off, just to be clear, how does he define VR?
He keeps it pretty straightforward. Virtual reality, obviously. But he frames it as a system fundamentally designed for immersion.
Putting you inside a virtual place.
Exactly. Allowing that full 360-degree movement, looking around, but also interacting. That's key.
Right, interaction, not just watching a 3D movie. You're in it, doing things.
Precisely. And yeah, he notes it got popularized back in the 2010s. Oculus Rift, HTC Vive, those early headsets.
But the argument is where the tech is now, it's capable of so much more than what we're commonly using it for.
That's the core point. The potential's still largely untapped outside of, well, games and niche applications.
So where does Oxford see that potential really making a difference first? One of the big ones he highlights is, maybe surprisingly, the construction industry.
Well, it makes sense if you think about VR's main trick, putting you anywhere, virtually.
Right.
So for building projects, imagine stepping inside the plans, not just looking at a blueprint or a 3D model on a screen, but actually being in the space.
And he gets specific, doesn't he? Like walking through the building, seeing it
Well,
furnished.
seeing how light falls, how spaces feel.
Hmm.
But crucially, Oxford emphasizes it's not just for looking.
The interaction part again?
Exactly. The source says you could use it to alter the design while you're immersed,
Hmm.
like move a wall, change a material, see the effect immediately.
Okay, that sounds powerful for catching problems early.
That's the idea,
Mhm.
improving the design, the quality, maybe even speeding up the whole process because you iron out kinks virtually before you build physically.
And he also mentioned tracking progress, right? Comparing the real build to the virtual twin.
Mm-hmm. Potentially reducing build times. And then there's the sales angle, showing buyers exactly what they're getting, letting them walk through it before it's finished.
That's a game changer for selling property off plan.
Definitely. So for you, think about it. The places where you live and work could be designed and built differently, more collaboratively, maybe faster, with fewer surprises. It shifts from abstract plans to like a tangible preview.
Okay, moving from buildings to bodies. Healthcare is another major area Oxford focuses on.
Yeah, he suggests VR could actually help fix some current issues in medicine.
How so? He mentions virtual appointments, right?
He does touch on that. Obviously, the doctor can't, physically examine you. That's the big limitation, he notes.
Sure.
But it could offer a more um, present feeling, a better face-to-face connection than just a standard video call for certain consultations.
Maybe better for bedside manner, virtually speaking?
Perhaps. But Oxford seems more focused on other applications, like training.
Ah, right. Letting doctors practice procedures.
Exactly. Practicing complex surgeries or even just routine procedures over and over in a super realistic virtual setting. No risk to a real patient.
That seems like a pretty obvious win. More practice, better skills.
Definitely. But then he gets into something potentially even more transformative, using VR not just for training, but as part of the treatment itself.
Okay, how does that work? He mentions therapy.
Yeah, therapy and treating specific conditions. Think PTSD or phobias.
How could VR help with, say, a phobia?
Well, the article explains it through exposure therapy. Imagine someone's afraid of heights.
Okay.
In VR, a therapist can create a virtual high place, a balcony, a cliff edge, but in a completely safe, controlled way. They can start low, gradually increase the height, all while the person is safely in a room wearing a headset.
So controlled exposure without any actual physical danger.
Precisely. It allows for that gradual desensitization in a way that's just really hard or sometimes impossible to manage safely in the real world.
And for therapy or meditation.
Creating calming environments. Maybe a virtual forest, a beach. Perfectly tailored, distraction-free spaces to aid therapy or mindfulness.
That's quite different. So thinking about this, it could mean easier access to some doctor visits, sure, but also maybe much safer training for medics and entirely new ways to treat mental health conditions.
That's the potential Oxford lays out. Healthcare, but with an added immersive dimension.
Okay, so we've had construction, healthcare. What's the third big area?
Virtual economies. This builds on trends we're already seeing.
Like cryptocurrency, digital money.
Exactly, and things like NFTs, those unique digital items people are buying.
Right, the non-fungible tokens, art, collectibles, that kind of thing.
So Oxford connects these ideas of digital currency, digital ownership, with the rise of immersive virtual worlds.
The metaverse concept.
Basically, yes. Persistent online spaces where you can interact, socialize, maybe work. His argument is, if you have these immersive VR spaces, and you already have ways to buy and own things digitally,
And you can build a whole economy inside VR.
that's the potential. Owning virtual land, buying virtual clothes or tools, maybe even different virtual currencies popping up that have real-world exchange value.
He sees precursors in things like, what, buying items inside video games?
Yeah, like in-app purchases, but potentially on a much grander, more integrated scale, creating a whole virtual world where you can live, buy, sell, socialize.
Oxford's conclusion on this.
That it might not be that far off. A
Mhm.
functioning virtual economy could emerge relatively soon, and that would really force us to rethink what value means.
When an asset could just be code representing land in a virtual world.
Exactly. How does that change your idea of wealth or work, or even just spending your leisure time and money?
So wrapping this up, based on Oxford's article, VR isn't just the next cool gadget for games.
Not at all. He presents it as a tool with, honestly, almost endless possibilities. Things that could fundamentally change construction
Transform parts of healthcare.
and even create entirely new economic landscapes online.
And the key takeaway is that this future, driven by rapid tech growth, might be closer than we tend to think.
It really paints a picture of VR impacting the very fabric of how we live and work.
Okay, so building on that last point about virtual economies, virtual living, here's something to chew on. If these virtual worlds become places where we can genuinely own things, build wealth, maybe even conduct significant parts of our social or professional lives, what does that do to the line between our physical life and our virtual one?
That's a deep question.
Right. What happens when value, real value, isn't just tied to physical stuff anymore, but exists just as strongly in digital assets, digital experiences?
Yeah.
Where does the real world end and the virtual one begin?
Definitely something to think about as VR keeps evolving so quickly.